The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Chairman, it's a pleasure to take part in this debate about the annual reviews from the 14-15 year, the year when the government did achieve, well, the New Zealand public, the public service achieved a surplus after 6 or 7 years of deficit, some of them very large. And I just want to acknowledge the work done by so many public servants, select committee members, chairs of select committees, in helping to produce essentially more for less. So at a time when money has been pretty tight, this is a period when public services have improved, and that is to a large extent due to the efforts of the public service and also my colleagues in the Cabinet. Mr Speaker, just to comment a bit on the Greens finance spokesman's words. I'll give the Greens credit, at least they've got their own internal coherence. I don't agree with, and I'll point out some ways in which I disagree with them, but it is quite a contrast to the Labor Party. The Greens, you know what they're going to say, you know how they're going to say it, generally with a bit of a nasty edge, although this member is a bit better than some of the previous occupants of that position, which is welcome because it makes it more likely that you can have a constructive discussion. Whereas with the Labor Party, you don't quite know what they're going to say, and it's pretty hard to connect one bit to another. So just to a couple of points raised by the Greens spokesman. Actually, as a result, spokeswoman, as a result of the tax changes made in 2010, the higher income brackets are actually paying a higher proportion of income tax. And there's a great deal less structuring around companies and trusts and sole proprietors and so on, because the tax systems for higher income earners is more coherent, harder to avoid, and they do pay at pretty much at the statutory rate. So that part of the sort of green prejudice is simply wrong. As it is about protecting the most vulnerable, well, as any number of the members of the Cabinet could attest, we spend an awful lot of time on not just protecting the most vulnerable, but working out how to assist them realise their aspirations. And just a couple of examples of that. New Zealand now has the highest one of the highest ratios of minimum wage to average wage in the developed world because of consistent increases in the minimum wage. 1st of April, just a few weeks ago, the first increases in base benefit rates for households with families in over 40 years. And this is the lesson the Greens should learn. If the Greens want a constructive discussion, then they should be a bit more objective about what is actually achieved so we can talk about how to achieve more. But, Mr Speaker, to come back to the financial reviews, I think a growing feature which is reflected actually in the material prepared by the Select Committee is the way the government's taking a longer-term view, in fact a multi-generational view, of what drives our expenditure. Sure, it's a good thing we got a surplus in 14-15 of around $400 million after much effort. But actually, if we want to have a surplus in 2025, there's decisions being made now which will affect that. The effectiveness of programs for 5-year-olds will determine whether they need support when they're 15 years old. And too often in the past, the government's been flying blind on whether our programs, our spending have an impact. Most of our spending is social spending. Most of it, we need to have a better idea with it what impact it has. By and large, in the mainstream services, it's fairly effective, but particularly for the most vulnerable, that the Greens keep talking about, and the most complex families, we've got quite some way to go. So, Mr Speaker, I expect that in the future we'll see more in our Select Committee reports in the financial review for this year, further progress on that shift to the long-term view that government's taking. We do have to account for this year's cash. That's important for the Parliament. but we do also have to work out whether it's going to contribute to the future financial sustainability of the New Zealand government.